Um, Anyways, I've been hanging around the Bahamas since the late 70s. I was a charter pilot out here and whatnot, and for some reason, I was always very interested in the history of the Bahamas, so I've actually been reading about it for 40 years. And I went on and got my ocean engineering degree, so I've been working out here for almost 40 years and have been privileged to work with guys like Pericles and whatnot. So that led me to kind of collecting maps of the Caribbean, so I ended up with a fantastic map of antique maps of the Caribbean, and which led me to do a book kind of weaving those maps into the history of the country, trying to make it in a pleasant way to learn history without boring yourself to death. I start the book with a little bit of geologic history, and I think there's actually even a talk on the monk seal tomorrow, but if you didn't know, you know there were actually seals here when man first got here. There were real large owls here, probably not when man got here, but in the earlier days, 10,000 years ago, sea level was about 160 feet lower than it is today. So the Bahama banks would have all been dry, and they would have been dry prairies that critters like this were living on. And then as sea level came up, of course, you get to the point where it's like it is today. And I talk a little bit about things like that in there. I also wanted to kind of tell and show people how large the Bahamas is. I do a lot of boating here too, besides being a pilot. Being a pilot, it's pretty quick to do the 600 miles from north, Walker's Key down to Great Inagua. But boy, I'll tell you, when you're boating 600 miles, you start getting a feel of how large this country really is. So to kind of demonstrate that, I put it over Florida. It goes up to Georgia, and superimposed it over England and whatnot, because I don't think people realize how really big this archipelago is. Another really interesting thing that you've probably seen before is the blue holes, and there's some blue hole experts here. But I went in one of these things in the 70s. I'm a little too old for that now. But it's very, very interesting that you can be, underwater in 50, 60 feet of water and see stalactites and stalagmites that obviously didn't form underwater. So it's the best right there in front of you example of how sea level has changed over time. So as I said earlier, 10,000 years ago, sea level was 160 feet lower. So these would have been caves. And recently they've been finding animal remains and whatnot in there that they can carbon date, and species that have gone extinct, and just all sorts of wonderful finds in these blue holes. So, and again, this book just touches on a lot of these things. The whole blue hole science is a wonderful thing. This actually is a reprint of something that was on the cover of National Geographic that they gave us permission to use. But there's people out there doing really good research right now on that topic. The Indians that came here, the Lucayan Indians, were about 1,000 years ago. The portion of the book on that, I had a friend of mine named Bob Carr, who's done a lot of research, archaeologist from Miami, who's done a lot of work out here in the Bahamas. He actually wrote this part and produced this map. So we talk a little bit about that. They came up from South America, worked their way all the way through. Anyhow, that's an interesting history too. The Spanish got them out, rounding them up, and by the early 1500s, Columbus got here in 1492. Well, by 1520, they had exterminated the Lucayan Indians, enslaved them to take them to work in Hispaniola or down off the coast of South America. So the Indians didn't last long when the Spanish got here. And here's the Spanish. Here they come. They landed in San Salvador. There's been a lot of debate about, well, was it San Salvador here, or did they land on Cat Island? Did they land on Samana? But I think it's pretty well accepted now, and Neil Seeley's done some really good work along those lines. Pretty well accepted now that it was indeed San Salvador. They went on to Rum Key, which was called Santa Maria de la Conception, which shouldn't get confused because there is a Conception Island here now, but that name was actually associated with Rum Key. Conception's a wonderful place if you haven't been there, the actual Conception Island. They went on to Long Island and down to Crooked Island. and over past the Ragged Islands and then on out of the Bahamas. And you always heard, in doing research for this book, I kind of dispelled some rumors, at least in my own mind. You always heard how they had these friendly encounters, the Spanish, with Christopher Columbus with the original Lucayan Indians. Well, by the time, they picked up 7 of them here on San Salvador, and by the time they got here at the second place, a couple of them were already trying to escape. So I don't know how friendly it really was. And then, like I said, in 25 years, they had wiped them out in the entire country. Here's I get into some of the maps that I have that I just love. This is 1579. And at this point, there's the exumas. You can see how crude things were. Here's Cuba, and 1579 was a long time ago, but the names were already starting to emerge here. Guanahani was here, which was the Arawak name for San Salvador. So on this map, it's actually more or less correct. There's Luthra. If we go one more, though, just to 1650, it has been named Triangulo. And all of a sudden, now Guanahani and San Salvador is where Cat Island is today. So for a couple hundred years, the maps were actually wrong. And Cat Island was called San Salvador. And that's why Columbus Point on Cat Island. And Cat Islanders will tell you today, that, hey, it was here for sure. But I think the archaeologists have all pretty much agreed that it was where San Salvador is today. But for a couple hundred years, it was actually wrong on the maps. It was Triangulo at first, then it became Watlings Island, and I don't think it officially became San Salvador until the 1920s. I put this slide in here. This is a bell a friend of mine found that I actually donated a replica of this to the Albert Lowe Museum in Green Turtle Key because they found it off of Munjak Key, and when he asked me to help return the bell to the Bahamas, and while I was doing that, I happened to be reading, I think it was Sandra Riley's history book, and voila, there was the wreck of the Port Royal in 1669. And we went and dated the bell, and it appears that is the bell. What's interesting about that is that's 1669. The Eleuthera adventurers got here in 1648. So it was only 20 years after they'd got there, yet these guys wrecked off Munjak. All of them got to shore, but by the time they got their act together to build a boat to go get rescued, half of them died, even though the Eleuthera adventurers were already in the Bahamas. But that just shows you how remote a place this was until later in time. This is an interesting map from 1695. It's got that's Abaco, Lucayan-esque, or however you say it back then, but you can see the barrier islands offshore, and Sigatu and whatnot. This is interesting because you can see that Cuba is to the left and Florida is up. So you're basically west is up. And there's not a lot of maps like that, but it's like, why would you have west up? And I had a cartographer explain that to me. It's like if you were coming from Europe to the Bahamas, west was up. So just like the heads-up display in your car or in your plane, in my case, they were making maps like that in 1695. The British Loyalists showed up after the Revolutionary War. This is right here. This is the museum actually where that bell is. That's the oldest Loyalist house that's still remaining up there. I think the Loyalists got to the Abacos in 1783. But the Loyalists, probably most of you know that story. They were loyal to the crown in the American Revolutionary War. They lost the war and kind of basically were run out of the country and settled over here. And that was a huge wave of settlement, and that's where they brought their possessions and their slaves and doubled the population of the Bahamas and inhabited a lot of the out islands that would probably be uninhabited today if it wasn't, for the Loyalists. But they failed. They failed in the long term because the soils basically played out. They just, after you farmed them for a few years, burnt down the ancient trees and whatnot. You just couldn't create enough soil to get things to grow. So the Loyalists bailed out, and the debris and their remains of their great houses and everything can still be found in the bush all over the outer Bahamas, well, and even here. This is my favorite map of all. I have this right by my dining room table, and it speaks a little bit to the history of Quizao. This is Cuba. This is Quizao, which is probably the most least known part of the Bahamas. It's in between the Florida Keys and the Bahamas. I've been spending a lot of time down there over the last 25 years. The interesting thing about this map, though, is it was a French map that was captured by the British. And that was right around the time of the Napoleonic Wars. I think the Battle of Trafalgar was in 1805, and this map was 1802. I think I showed this in a presentation I gave a couple years ago, so pardon if I'm repeating it. But that island has great history that involved Ernest Hemingway and Howard Hughes and just a lot of intrigue and neat stuff that went on there. During the Civil War, there was a big boom to the Bahamas. Basically, the Confederates were looking for guns from Europe, and Europe was looking for cotton from America. So the docks to Nassau were the trading spot, and blockade runners made a lot of money, and the Royal Victoria Hotel was built during that time, and a lot of other things. So there was a big boom in commerce there for a few years during the Civil War. And the next big boom was Prohibition. And an interesting thing about Prohibition is the Bahamians could actually sell liquor legally. And Charlie Bethel gave me this, and his forefathers were basically legal representatives of a liquor company in England. So everybody's thinking, oh, geez, everybody's breaking the law. Bahamians weren't breaking the law. They were just profiting from it. It was the Americans that would come and pick up liquor and run it into the United States. They were the ones breaking the laws. So a lot of the fortunes that were made in the Bahamas were made perfectly legally, I think. So, at least in that period. I went on a little bit later in the book. I wrote another book on where I'm from in Naples, Florida, and what really fascinated people was what the land was before, because Naples is a relatively new place, and we have a lot of subdivisions that were built in the 50s that were mangrove swamp or lowlands or whatever, that all of a sudden those are the most expensive coastal properties, in Florida and some in the world. Anyways, same is true of the Bahamas. This is actually Lyford Key right here in 1958, and these excavations right here are where Lyford Key's harbor is today. And you can see basically the entrance to Old Fort Bay. The creek right here would have been there, but no entrance channel to Lyford Key or anything. And then what I do in the book is I have this 1958 aerial, and then the next page is a clear overlay that shows you what it looks like today. And it's hard, you can't do it on slides, but in the book you can actually see what's under here. So if your lot is right here, you can see what it was. Were you in a bay? Were you on a creek? Were you in the mangroves? And so we did overlays of both Lyford Key and of Old Fort Bay, and those are always very popular with the people that live there because they just can't believe, and when you go to these waterfront communities all around Florida and the Bahamas and the Caribbean and the world for that matter, you forget what was there. And I'm an ocean engineer by trade. We don't do that anymore. But when you go to places that have seawalls and stuff, you can pretty much rest assured you're standing on something that was wetlands or mangroves or something very low. And back in the day, the people that created these subdivisions, and this was E.P. Taylor that created Lyford Key, they're sort of the heroes of the day because those lowlands were full of mosquitoes. It was, there wasn't a lot of jobs. It was just a good thing, to get, to turn swamps into subdivisions. And of course, that sounds horrifying today. Oh my God, we're going to fill up the mangroves and everything. Well, it was a different time. Those people were the heroes of the day. They were providing employment. They were creating waterfront properties. And some of the things that we treasure today, in Florida and the Bahamas were created by, doing something that would be unthinkable today. Same thing. Here's Old Fort Bay. There's the Lyford Key entrance channel again, and there's the Old Fort Creek running up. And again, this is all today. Oh, I'm sorry, I was right. That's the Old Fort Creek running up. And today we have another subdivision. And this is new. And anyhow, so a lot of people find that interesting. My company, we also make maps of the Bahamas. We started that at the beginning of the recession, just as, I guess, basically something to keep people involved, employed and whatnot. Those have become somewhat popular. This one happens to show all of the lighthouses and the dates that were established. The oldest one, the oldest continuous one, I think is 1817, which is here on New Providence, Hog Key Light. But most of them were mid to late 1800s. The Imperial Lighthouse Service out of England were doing these all over the Bahamas. I mean, from Great Anagua to Key Sal's got one up in the north to of course, Hope Town and those other places. That really improved safety in the Bahamas and cut down on shipwrecks and cut down on wrecking, which was a source of income. The last thing I do in the book is I do individual, the 20 most populated islands in the Bahamas. I do an individual history of those. And again, I try to keep it to one page so I don't kill people with history. But I also show where the island is, and then to make it interesting, we show some iconic things. This is Mount Alvernia. This is the highest spot in the Bahamas. It's 206 feet. This is the Armbrister Plantation. Tony Armbrister's one of the descendants is still out there running for Fernandez Bay, which is one of my favorite places. And we show some underwater pictures and some aerials. I do a lot of flying, so there's a lot of aerials in there. And then we show our modern map of Cat Island. And that is what we did. So that's it.